Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to episode number 95 of International Relations This Week. Every Wednesday under this series at 8 p.m., we have been covering important geopolitical developments of the last 1 week which have a bearing on India's national interests. These discussions are strictly from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services examination. So if you have been benefiting from the initiative, do support us by liking the video, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's get started with episode 95 of IR this week. First, we shall take a look at the important topics that we are going to cover in today's discussion. We shall start with the G20. We will talk about the G20 summit, which was held last week, and we are going to discuss India's presidency of G20. From 1st of December, India will be taking over the presidency of G20, and India will be leading this important grouping in 2023. The next G20 summit will be hosted in India as well. So in this context, we need to understand the background of G20, understand the outcomes of the recent summit, and talk about the challenges and opportunities for India as it is going to lead G20 for the next year. So we shall discuss this topic in complete detail. Next, we shall talk about the No Money for Terror conference, which was hosted by India last week. This conference gave India an opportunity to take steps with other like-minded countries to counter terror financing. So this is another important topic we're going to cover. Then we shall talk about the concept of Friendshoring, which is being promoted by the United States. We shall also talk about the Moscow format of talks related to the political situation in Afghanistan. And finally, we shall move towards West Asia region, where Turkey has carried out Operation Claw Sword, which was a series of airstrikes against Kurdish militant camps. This has increased tensions in the sensitive West Asia region, and hence we need to understand its implications. So in the next 45 to 50 minutes, we shall try to cover all these important developments in complete detail. So let's start with the first topic, which is G20. So as I was mentioning, last week at Bali in Indonesia, the 17th G20 summit was hosted by Indonesia. Indonesia was holding the presidency of G20 for 2022, and during this summit, a number of important developments have taken place. But the biggest development was that India has been handed over the presidency of G20 for the next year. The baton has been passed to India through a formal ceremony, which you can see captured in this image over here. The gavel, which is a symbolic representation of the presidency, was transferred from the Indonesian leader to Prime Minister Modi, signifying the transfer of presidency from Indonesia to India. The G20 is an important geopolitical grouping that is focused on stabilizing the global economy. The G20 has diversified its focus to other important areas as well, but the primary focus of the group remains on stabilizing the global economy. This grouping was founded back in 1999, following the economic crisis in Asia. In the 1990s, after the dot-com bubble burst, a major economic crisis was triggered in many Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. This led to global economic chaos, and this is what brought together the countries of G20 to coordinate their economic policies and together to work towards stabilizing the global economy. So this became a platform for the finance ministers of G20 and the governors of the respective central banks to work together and to coordinate their policies. After the 2008-2009 global recession, the grouping acquired even more significance, and since then, it was made into a permanent feature. Since 2008-2009, the G20 summit takes place annually, where the leaders of these countries interact, the prime ministers and presidents. They interact regularly and talk about key economic issues of the world, along with other important geopolitical issues that are affecting the economic stability of the world. So today, this group has become a platform for developing countries, middle-income countries, to work closely with developed and industrialized nations. It brings together the 20 largest economies and provides them a platform to address all these key issues. So from the prelims point of view, you should be familiar with the members of G20. This group includes a number of developed industrialized nations such as US, United Kingdom, Germany, and others, even Japan, Australia. It includes a number of middle-income countries, emerging and developing economies such as Argentina, Canada, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, South Africa, South Korea, Italy, Turkey, and of course China and France. Then even European Union, which represents the 27 major countries of the European region, is also a part of the group. So 19 countries plus one grouping, which is European Union, together constitute the G20. So this economic grouping, it has the ability to influence the global economy because these countries together, they represent 60% of the global population. Together, they account for 80% of global GDP and 75% of the global trade. So this is what gives G20 the ability to influence the global economy, to deal with the pressing challenges and help stabilize the global economy. The presidency of this group is held by one of the member countries on the basis of rotation. The presidency rotates every year amongst the members. So for 2022, Indonesia was the presidency, and now the presidency is being transferred to India for 2023. So the agenda of this group for a particular year is set by the Troika, which is basically a group of 3 countries which represent the current, the former, and the next presidency holders. That is, the current presidency holder comes together with the previous presidency holder and the next presidency holder, and these 3 countries form the Troika. So as of now, India is taking over the presidency of G20 from 1st December. Indonesia would become the former presidency of G20, and Brazil would be holding the presidency for 2024. So these 3 countries, which have played a key role in leading G20, or which are going to play a key role in leading G20, they form the Troika and they set the agenda. They identify the key issues to be discussed and they help the other countries to chart out a solution to deal with the pressing global economic challenges. So it's in this context that the topic becomes very, very important. From the mains perspective, you should know the key outcomes of the latest summit, the 17th summit, which was held at Bali. And we should talk about the opportunities and challenges for India in the coming year. So in the recent summit, the countries discussed all the key issues. They focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Many countries, they openly criticized Russia for its aggression. And even India, which has often taken a middle stand on this issue, pushed Russia to end the conflict as soon as possible, as the war has destabilized the global economy. The Russia-Ukraine war has had a huge impact on global supply chains, on food commodity prices, and it is affecting every country in the world. The divide between Western countries and Russia, the economic sanctions on Russia, it is hurting the global economy, and hence India also has called upon Russia to bring an end to this conflict and help stabilize the global economic order. Along with this, the G20 countries focused on key global economic issues that are emerging. It is widely feared that the global economy is headed towards a major recession. Inflation rates have shot up around the world. And to counter inflation, central banks have been raising interest rates. Especially the US Federal Reserve has raised interest rates, which has led to a flight of capital from developing economies back towards the United States. There is a crisis in the job market as well. And commodity prices have shot up. Essential commodities have become expensive, including food, oil, etc. So this presents a frightening situation where the global economy could head into a major recession that could last many months or many years. And hence the G20 took stock of the situation and they have tried to work out solutions to deal with the emerging crisis. They spoke about the food security crisis as well, which has been triggered by the disruption in food supplies. Food supplies have been majorly hit because of the Russia-Ukraine war. We have made a mention of this in our previous sessions as well. the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has disrupted the supplies of essential food items such as wheat, sunflower seeds, sunflower oil, barley, corn, etc. So this is leading to disruption in food supplies, and poor countries in Africa, emerging economies in Asia, even developed countries are getting hit, and food prices have shot up, leading to widespread inflation. So this leads to developmental problems in some of the poor countries because food insecurity drives hunger, malnutrition, and it could even have very serious health implications and social implications because shortage of food can trigger civil wars, unrest, riots, etc. So this is another key economic issue which was dealt with by the G20 summit. They focused on climate change as well because parallelly COP27, the 27th Conference of Parties to the Climate Change Convention, was taking place at Egypt. And as countries have again failed to work out a lasting solution to deal with global warming and climate change, the issue was brought up and discussed at G20 as well. Special attention was paid to digital transformation of the global economy, especially India, along with few other like-minded countries. They gave a strong push towards adopting digital payments, towards moving towards a cashless economy, which will help in solving several economic issues, including money laundering, tax evasion, black money, etc. Digital transformation will also help in driving innovation. It will help in triggering job creation in the market. So this became a key focus area for the recently held G20 summit. Then G20 group along with World Bank have launched a pandemic fund. The World Bank took the initiative here and has established the pandemic fund, which was launched by Indonesia as the head of G20. This fund would enable further research to deal with future epidemics and pandemics. It will help the global community to jointly combat any future infectious diseases that has the potential of leading to an epidemic or a pandemic. So these are some of the important outcomes of the latest summit, and the biggest outcome for India was that the presidency has been transferred to India. Now this is a great opportunity for India because this is one of the biggest events that India will be hosting. It gives us a great opportunity to show our leadership, to build consensus amongst various countries and solve contentious issues. India could provide the way forward. So India has already launched an official logo, which you saw in one of the earlier slides, and it has even come out with a theme for the G20 summit. If I can take you back to that image, you can see here, this is the new G20 logo which India has brought out. It was recently launched by the Prime Minister. And the theme has been identified as One Earth, One Family, One Future. This is in line with our civilizational principle of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, where we treat the whole world as one community. So here India's intention is to drive global cooperation so that we work together as one community to deal with the pressing challenges of the world. So without a doubt, it establishes India's leadership position. It gives us a great opportunity for the next 1 year to drive consensus amongst these countries on important critical issues which are facing the world. The G20 summit, which will be hosted by India in 2023, will also involve many other dialogues throughout the year. So India will have constant high-level engagement with all these countries. Across Indian cities, frequent G20 events will be taking place between ministers, top officials and leaders, and the respective Sherpas or the envoys of each country. They will interact with each other and they will set the agenda for the upcoming G20 summit in India. So India, as the leader of the Troika group, will work with Indonesia and Brazil, and the respective envoys will help in setting the agenda, and it will give India a great opportunity next year to work out possible solutions for important issues. However, there are important challenges as well. As India is going to head the presidency, there will be key challenges that might hinder India's progress. The biggest challenge for India would be to bridge the divide between Russia, China, and the Western countries on the other side. As you know, global geopolitical tensions are at an all-time high. The Western countries have again formed a bloc of sorts, where US and European countries have aligned together with Russia and China on the opposite side. A new Cold War has begun between Western countries and China. Western countries led by US have targeted Russia as well, and Russia has counter-retaliated, thus leading to increased geopolitical tensions. This is affecting the global economy as well and other key areas. So it's very important to build consensus between them and act as a bridge, and that is exactly what India did during the recent summit. On contentious issues like Russia-Ukraine conflict, India actually played a neutral role and tried to act as a bridge between the Western world, Russia and China, to bring these important powers together. However, the biggest hurdle would be the continuation of these tensions. So India would like for the war to end as soon as possible. That is why India urged Russia to bring this conflict to an end. The other challenges would be the continuation of the economic crisis. If the global economy heads towards a recession, and if the macroeconomic factors are not looking good, it could pose a very big challenge for India's presidency. Then other developmental issues related to climate change, sustainable development goals, etc., would also be a challenge for India, because COP27 has failed in working out any lasting solution to deal with climate change. The only positive development at COP27 was the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, through which developed countries will compensate the vulnerable nations for the damages that they are going to suffer due to increasing extreme weather events. Apart from this small positive development, COP27 is largely a failure, and the world is nowhere close to achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement. So here, India will have a major responsibility to drive consensus and to drive further cooperation between the G20 members, so we can have some concrete outcomes with regard to climate change, achieving our SDG goals, etc. So it's in this context that India is taking this role very seriously. India is gearing up to host the G20 summit, and Amitabh Kant, a senior retired IAS officer who was also the CEO of Niti Aayog, has been appointed as the Sherpa to lead India's agenda and work with the other members to ensure that the next summit brings out some positive outcomes. Now let's move to the second topic and talk about the No Money for Terror conference, which was hosted by India last week. At New Delhi, India hosted the No Money for Terror conference, which is focused on combating terror financing. So this was the third such conference which took place, and Prime Minister Modi addressed the gathering as India was playing host to the conference. Many countries took part in this event, along with many important international organizations. So Prime Minister Modi, along with India's Home Minister, India's Foreign Minister, they all addressed the gathering and they brought up the issue of terrorism and terror financing. The Prime Minister specifically focused on the definition of terrorism, how few countries are biased when it comes to dealing with few forms of terrorism. This was a reference by India to state-sponsored terrorism, which has become the biggest menace, and India happens to be the biggest victim of it, as our neighbor Pakistan has consistently sponsored terrorism against India. State actors like Pakistan have created various channels for terror financing, which has provided unlimited funds to radical groups and terror groups that are targeting our country. So India was very clear that the world should end the ambiguity in dealing with terrorism. The PM called upon the other countries to end the definition of good and bad terrorism. India has always seen terrorism as a serious security threat and a societal threat, and we don't want countries to make distinctions between different terror outfits. Few countries, they have the habit of treating few terror groups as good for their national interests, as they often use terrorism as a part of their national foreign policy. Pakistan, few West Asian countries, major powers like Russia, US, they've often used terrorism as a tool to achieve their geopolitical interests. So India has been campaigning for many years to bring an end to this ambiguity while dealing with terrorism, and it has called for a unified approach mainly to tackle terror financing. So this conference was started in 2018 with the initiative of France. It was the French government which hosted the first conference on no money for terror. And the next summit in 2019 was hosted by Australia. India was supposed to host the third conference in 2020 itself. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, it had been postponed. And now India has hosted the third conference for combating terror financing. Now, some of you might wonder, why have a separate conference when we already have an international organization called FATF, which specifically deals with terror financing? The FATF, or Financial Action Task Force, it's an intergovernmental organization which we have covered many times in our previous sessions. FATF is exclusively focusing on countering money laundering and terror financing. So then what is the need to have a parallel conference that is no money for terror conference? Now this is where you need to understand. No money for terror conference will act as a complement to the FATF. See, FATF is an intergovernmental grouping where countries are holding membership of the FATF. At a governmental level, the FATF members are collaborating and working together to combat money laundering and terror financing. But NMFT, or No Money for Terror, it's a ministerial initiative where the foreign ministers, home ministers of the respective countries will interact regularly and try to work out solutions to deal with terror financing. So it's not an overlap of jurisdiction. NMFT is rather a complement to the efforts of FATF. So during the recent summit that was hosted by India, around 72 countries took part, along with 15 international organizations. Even the UN, FATF, World Bank, all these important organizations were also represented at the No Money for Terror conference. During the recent summit, talks were held on 4 important areas, which included identifying the global trends in terrorism and terror financing. Because terror outfits are adopting innovative tools for financing their radical extremist activities. So to identify the global patterns and trends which are emerging, there was a separate dialogue which was held. Special focus was paid for formal and informal channels of terror financing. Today, terror outfits, radical organizations, and even few state agencies, such as few intelligence agencies of few foreign governments, they have employed various formal, informal channels to route funds for terrorist activities. They often use informal channels, such as Hawala networks, to move money around and to fund terror and radical activities. Even formal channels, the formal banking system also has been used to fund terror activities by engaging in the practice of money laundering. So this conference is focusing both on the formal and informal channels of terror financing, along with focus on emerging technologies and how they are enabling terror financing. Today, online transactions, the emergence of cryptocurrencies, digital wallets, they have created new routes, new alternatives for radical outfits, state agencies to transfer money and to fund terrorist activities. As you know, cryptocurrencies in particular have raised a lot of concern because the anonymity they provide can be easily misused to fund terror activities. Even online transactions, especially transactions happening on the dark net, has been a great source of concern with regard to countering terrorism. So there was a separate discussion on understanding how emerging technologies are enabling terror financing and what can be done to curb the menace. Finally, the countries worked together to bring out international cooperation in order to deal with terror financing. Because terror financing cannot be dealt with by just one or few countries. It requires a global response because terrorism is a transboundary threat. Terror activities, terror financing, it involves movement of money across multiple nations, across multiple jurisdictions, and without global cooperation, it might be impossible to plug terror financing. So these were the important themes or issues that were addressed during the latest conference, and India as the host of the conference, brought out few important issues and proposed few new initiatives. India has proposed for a permanent secretariat for this conference so that it could become more structured and formal, and it could become a regular feature where every year at a ministerial level, the home ministers and foreign ministers of these countries can interact and work out solutions to combat terror financing. That's the reason why the Prime Minister made a few important statements. The Prime Minister, while he addressed the gathering, he called for a uniform zero-tolerance approach to defeat terrorism. He called upon countries to stop using terrorism as a part of their foreign policy and have a unified response to combat terror financing. So India has given a push to establish a permanent secretariat for the NMFT conference so it could become a more structured response and the initiative could be held regularly and countries could work together to pool their resources in order to fight terror financing. So India has reiterated its position that we need to have a common definition of terrorism. We cannot deal with terror outfits through a foreign policy approach. You cannot distinguish between good and bad terrorism. And we should come together to combat all forms of terrorism and all forms of terror financing. India has even pointed out the misuse of non-profit organizations to spread radical ideology and to fund terror activities. This is in the light of the recent ban that India placed on Popular Front of India, which has been allegedly enabling terror activities. So India has brought up this concern regarding how NGOs, non-profit organizations, political outfits, they are becoming mediums to channel funds for terror outfits. They are involved in encouraging and propagating radical ideologies as well. So India has brought up this issue to pay attention to non-profit organizations, non-government entities, which might be playing a role in enabling terrorism and terror financing. So these were some important initiatives and proposals brought up by India, and the topic can be very important both for prelims and also for mains. Now moving to the next topic, we shall talk about the concept of friendshoring, which has been promoted by the United States. This term has gained a lot of attention in the last few days. So you need to understand what is friendshoring, why is it required, which country is pushing for it, and what is its significance. The concept of friendshoring is mainly being promoted by the United States, and last week, the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, she was in India, and she brought up this concept of friendshoring and called upon India to work with US to promote the model of friendshoring so that we can reduce our dependency on unreliable global supply chains. This was basically a reference to unreliable supply chains which are dominated by countries like Russia and China, which are driven by a different ideology and different geopolitical interests other than that of the US. As US shares intense rivalry with China and Russia, the supply chains that they control has created economic and strategic challenges for US and Western countries. This problem has emerged in the last 2-3 years, especially since the pandemic broke out. The COVID-19 pandemic, it disrupted the global supply chains that were dominated by China. And China's strict zero COVID policy has continued lockdowns in China. It has disrupted global supplies of key commodities, key products, and it has very badly hit US and Western countries and their companies which depended on Chinese supplies. Next, the Russia-Ukraine war has had a similar impact. So the disruption in these supply chains, which are controlled or dominated by ideological rivals such as China and Russia, has affected the key supplies of essential commodities, raw materials, products to some countries, especially the Western countries. So it's in this context that US is promoting the concept of friendshoring. So let me explain what this concept actually entails. It's an economic strategy where like-minded countries will come together to source the essential commodities from within these countries. So US would mainly rely on its close allies in Europe, a few other friendly nations like India and others, and they will create a common economic network and a supply chain within themselves so that they can source essential commodities, materials, components within this group, so that they can reduce their dependency on unreliable countries, countries which have a different ideology. They can reduce their dependency on unstable supply chains, which could be seen as a geopolitical and an economic threat for these countries. So this is what you mean by the concept of friendshoring. Because see, the US was very badly hit when the pandemic broke out. American companies, which depended heavily on Chinese supplies, on Chinese imports, they took a very big hit because of the lockdown restrictions and the massive disruption in the global supply chain as a result of China imposing strict restrictions and lockdown regulations. Even essential supplies like HIV medication, malaria vaccines, they were disrupted because of the events that were triggered by the pandemic. So since then, US has been trying to shift away from its dependency on China. It has given a push to American companies as well to diversify the sources of essential commodities and raw materials. Then came the Russia-Ukraine war, which magnified this impact. The disruption again caused by the Russia-Ukraine war affected US and Western countries and their companies in sourcing essential commodities and raw materials. So this not only has economic implications, it has strategic and geopolitical implications. So in the last 1.5 to 2 years, US has been pushing its companies to first produce essential commodities within the country, within their own home country. And they have labeled this concept as reshoring or onshoring, where American companies will start producing the essential commodities within the US without having to depend on China or on the global supply chains. This is quite similar to India's Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative. It's about self-reliance, building self-reliance or independence with regard to essential commodities. The second approach that US has taken is to promote a concept called nearshoring, where American companies will set up manufacturing facilities and source raw materials, products and commodities from countries which are located nearby, countries which are closer to the US physically and geographically, so that it will cut the dependency of US on global supply chains. And the third concept that has been promoted by US is friendshoring, which was initially labeled as allied shoring. Under this concept, US is pushing American companies to depend more on allied countries, countries which share similar interests and similar ideologies. So US is working with these friendly, like-minded nations as well, so that they can create a common pool of resources, so that they can reduce their dependency on Russia, China and other global supply chains. And tentatively, this concept was initially named as allied shoring. Later, this concept has evolved and economists have given it the name friendshoring, where friendly countries will work together to source the essential commodities, raw materials and products. So it's essentially a common trade bloc of sorts that the US is pushing for. If not a free trade agreement, if not a common customs union, it is somewhat a common trade bloc where US will depend on India, India will depend on US, they will depend on Japan, maybe Australia, European countries, etc., as they're all like-minded countries with similar interests and similar ideologies. The whole idea here is to cut down dependency on unreliable supply chains and mainly on their geopolitical rivals, that is China and Russia. Now, this is where it gets interesting for India. The question is, should India opt for friendshoring? Should we align openly with US and Western countries? Because Russia is a very close friend of India. China is a neighbor. Of course, India has hostility with China, but India wouldn't like to be seen as part of a common trade bloc that is aligned against China. So this presents both opportunities and challenges for India. Many experts feel that friendshoring could actually reverse the gains of globalization. In the last 3-4 decades, the globalized world has brought a lot of benefits. It truly diversified global manufacturing, where every country would depend on the other country. It triggered massive economic growth. So there have been a lot of gains from globalization, from building global supply chains. But now, through friendshoring, you're going to reverse these gains, where only few countries will get into these common trading blocks while leaving out the rest. This could be contrary to the very spirit of WTO, the World Trade Organization. The WTO has worked hard in the last 2-3 decades to put in place a fair trading mechanism that will facilitate global trade. The WTO has estimated that the Russia-Ukraine war, if it leads to a division between the Western and Eastern countries, this alone could bring down the global GDP by 5% if economies become inward-looking. If Western countries cut off and reduce their trading relations with Russia and the allies of Russia, this could bring down the global economy by almost 5% of the global GDP. Similar concern has been expressed by Raghuram Rajan, the former RBI governor and a top economist. He has said that the concept of friendshoring makes sense when you're building this common trading bloc for sensitive items that have a national security implication. If you're coming together with allied countries and friendly nations only to procure and produce and trade sensitive items which are used in defense, which are used in military equipment, which are having national security implications, then the concept of friendshoring makes sense because there is a strategic motive, a national security angle to it. But if this concept expands to other regular day-to-day commodities, if you expand this to essential items in food, oil, and other industrial commodities, then it could have an adverse impact on the economy because few countries will become closed economies. They will be reversing all the gains of globalization and leading to an inward-looking economy. So these concerns have been brought up by many experts. Even the WTO has similar concerns about friendshoring because it could restrict global trade and it could result in a downturn, an economic downturn. And this is the last thing that the global economy needs, that too at a time when we are headed towards a possible recession. So friendshoring presents great opportunities for India. It could improve our trade with US and Western countries. India could become a manufacturing powerhouse because many Western companies might start setting up their manufacturing facilities in India. They would look to diversify away from China. In fact, this has already started happening since the start of the pandemic. Many US tech firms, many automobile manufacturers have already started diversifying their manufacturing plants, and they're looking at India, Vietnam, Thailand, Turkey, Brazil to set up their manufacturing facilities. So this could be a great opportunity for India. However, the impact on the global economy, the reverse in globalization, and the geopolitical implications of this could harm India as well. So it presents both opportunities and challenges. So that's why India is still not sure about how closely to get involved with US and others on the concept of friendshoring. So we need to watch how India will react to this. But the US has been urging India in the last few weeks to promote the concept of friendshoring so that like-minded countries can align together and create a common trading bloc for essential commodities and key components. Coming to the fourth topic, we'll talk about the Moscow format talks that's related to Afghanistan. The Moscow format talks was held at Moscow last week. The fourth meeting took place. This format, which is a Russian initiative led by Russia, it has primarily focused on political stabilization of Afghanistan. This initiative was started in 2017 when it became clear that US is going to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, thus leading to political volatility in Afghanistan. This was much before Taliban took over the country. So Russia took up the initiative and it brought together a few important regional powers that have an interest in Afghanistan and formed the Moscow dialogue or the Moscow format, which has held 4 rounds of talks till now with regard to the political situation in Afghanistan. When the initiative was launched by Russia, its primary focus was to enable dialogue between Taliban, the then Afghan government, and other political stakeholders in Afghanistan. Russian interest was to ensure that there is political stability and an inclusive government is formed. An inclusive government is formed to stabilize the country and to provide for reconciliation between the different warring factions in Afghanistan. As Afghanistan was was devastated by years of conflict. The Russian objective here was to bring together the different political stakeholders, including the Taliban and other rival factions, the political parties and the then civilian government, and push them towards a dialogue so that they could work out a political solution and form a stable, inclusive government. This was the agenda of Moscow format, which was launched by Russia in 2017. So over the years, 3 rounds of talks had taken place, and last week the 4th meeting was held by Russia. This acquires all the more significance because now things have really changed in Afghanistan. Last year, the Taliban refused to hold any talks with the then Afghan government. And as soon as the American troops pulled out from the country, Taliban toppled the Afghan government and has captured power in the country. So last year as well, the 3rd meeting of Moscow format took place, where India was also a participant. And this time again, India has actively participated in the Moscow format. So from a prelims point of view, you should know the members which are involved in Moscow format talks. It includes Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, all the Central Asian countries, the 5 Central Asian countries, and of course India, along with representatives from Afghanistan. These are the participants in the Moscow format. This has been a great platform for India especially because it has given India an opportunity to interact with the Taliban since last year. See, before Taliban took over, India had a policy of not talking to Taliban directly because India was treating Taliban as a terror outfit due to its proximity to Pakistan and other anti-India terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Toiba and the others. But after Taliban captured power, India had to accept the reality, and it has been trying to reach out to Taliban to hold a political dialogue with Taliban because India has major interests to protect in Afghanistan. So through Moscow format, India did reach out to Taliban leaders last year, and again this year as well, India has actively taken part in this summit. So here the focus of all the countries was on stabilizing Afghanistan. Because ever since Taliban took over, there has been a humanitarian crisis in the country. There is a shortage of essential commodities, including food supplies. In the last 1 year, India itself has dispatched a lot of food assistance to Afghanistan. We have reopened our embassy, which was shut down earlier after Taliban had taken over. We have reopened the embassy and we are resuming our diplomatic ties, and we are openly and directly engaging with the Taliban today. So Moscow format is a great platform for India to not just engage with Taliban and Afghanistan, but also with other important regional powers which all have an interest in stabilizing Afghanistan. It gives India an opportunity to work with Russia, China, Iran, and even Pakistan, which plays a key role in Afghanistan. So during the 4th summit that was held last week, the focus has been on stabilizing the country, facilitating talks between Taliban and other political stakeholders, in leading to the formation of an inclusive government, and ensure that the people of Afghanistan are given the required assistance as they have been suffering immensely due to the economic and political crisis in the country. The other focus of Moscow format is on working out a regional solution to counter terrorism. Along with stabilizing Afghanistan and the region, the other focus of the format is to tackle terrorism which emanates from the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. Central Asia, Russia, China, all these countries, even Iran, they're all affected by terrorism that emanates from the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt. For example, China specifically is concerned about a terror group called ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which has been formed by a few radical Uyghur extremists who have been fighting for independence from China, as allegedly China has committed gross violations against the Uyghur community. So Uyghurs who have close links in Central Asia and Afghanistan, Pakistan, some of them have taken up radicalism and have formed this terror outfit called ETIM, which targets China. Similarly, the radicalism, terrorism from Afghanistan, Pakistan spills over into Central Asia and Russia as well. India, of course, is already a very big victim of the terror infrastructure that Pakistan has created along the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt. So countering terrorism and radicalism is a key focus area of the Moscow format. So all these key issues were discussed, and finally these countries suggested few recommendations to the Taliban. But Taliban has not promised that it's going to accept these recommendations. Taliban was also a participant, but Taliban has not given any commitment whether it's going to accept the recommendations of the Moscow format. The whole interest of these countries is to stabilize the country and lead to the formation of an inclusive government that represents the interests of not just the Taliban but all the other stakeholders in Afghanistan. But as of now, there are no signs that Taliban is going to budge. Taliban is likely to retain its stronghold and it is likely to continue its oppression of minorities, women and children. So that is the reason why this topic and development is very important for us. Now coming to the last topic for today, we'll take a look at West Asia and a crisis which has emerged in Turkey. A few days back, there was a terror attack in Istanbul. There was a bomb blast which took place in a crowded commercial area of Istanbul. And Turkey has blamed this terror attack on Kurdish militant groups. Following this, Turkey has launched devastating airstrikes against Kurdish areas which are located in neighboring Iraq and Syria. This is where few Kurdish militant groups are operating from Iraq and Syria, which are neighbors of Turkey. And Turkey has launched a major airstrike through an operation which has been codenamed as Operation Crossword. So this topic was in news over the last 1 week, and hence it's important for us because it has implications for West Asian stability. To understand this topic, first you need to know who are the Kurds, where are they located, what is the Kurdish movement all about, and why Turkey is targeting these outfits. What's the reason behind it? The Kurds are an ethnic group, a very important ethnic group of West Asia, and they are found to be spread out across multiple countries in West Asia. You can find the Kurd community in parts of Turkey over here, and they're also found in neighboring countries such as Syria, Iraq, and parts of Iran and few parts of Armenia as well. These are the Kurd inhabited areas. The Kurds, who constitute a very unique and a very different ethnic group, they have their own unique culture, they have their own unique faith and practices. And since many decades, one of the complaints, one of the grievances of the Kurdish community in Turkey especially is that Turkey has discriminated against them and oppressed them. And this has triggered Kurdish nationalism. The Kurds have taken up a nationalist movement from many years, seeking the formation of a separate country in order to protect their identity, their resources. And they have been leading a movement to create Kurdistan, which would unite all the Kurd areas, especially the Kurd regions in Turkey, and form this independent country called Kurdistan. This nationalist movement, the Kurdish nationalist ideology, it actually traces back its origin all the way back to the Ottoman Empire. Since those days, the Kurds have always had conflicts and issues with the Turks and the Shias as well in Iraq, Syria and Iran. So over the decades, this has evolved into a nationalist militant terror movement, which is seeking the liberation of these areas, especially the Kurd areas in Turkey, to form this independent nation called Kurdistan. One of the major militant groups is the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which has led a number of attacks against Turkey. The PKK and other Kurdish groups, they have been in news in the last few years because these Kurd militant groups, they have helped the United States to counter Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The Kurdish outfits that we are mentioning, like PKK, YPG and others, these Kurdish militant groups, they were used by the United States to counter Islamic State, which had created a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. So Kurds have played an important role geopolitically. But Kurds and their militant outfits have been resisted, targeted and opposed by Turkey as the movement for Kurdistan threatens the integrity and sovereignty of Turkey. But since many decades, the allegation is that Turkey has constantly discriminated and oppressed the Kurdish minority. Because in Turkey, they constitute an ethnic minority. through its constitution, through its various laws, Turkey has often targeted the Kurdish people. It has limited their opportunities. It has oppressed and prevented them from practicing their culture. It has taken legislative steps which will target their cultural religious practices. So this has aggravated the Kurdish rebellion and it has pushed them to take up militancy and terrorism against Turkey. So this is a conflict that you see here in this region, and Turkey has always opposed these outfits, especially the PKK, which has been designated as a terrorist organization by Turkey and its allies, which is US and European Union. As you know, Turkey is a member of NATO. It's very closely aligned with US and European Union as well. So Turkey actually had an issue when US took the support of Kurdish groups to target Islamic State. But after ISIS was more or less defeated in Iraq and Syria, US abandoned the Kurds. The US didn't extend any support to the Kurd groups. And now Turkey is reportedly using military tactics to oppress the Kurds further in the name of tackling militancy and terrorism. So the terror attack which happened in Istanbul last week was blamed on the Kurdish militant outfits, even though no group has claimed the attack. But according to Turkey, the terror attack was carried out by Kurd groups based out of Iraq and Syria. So that's the reason why Turkey has retaliated with a major airstrike against Kurdish militant camps located in Iraq and Syria. And the Turkish president, Erdogan, has even indicated that Turkey might launch a ground assault into Syria, maybe even into Iraq, to target the Kurdish militant and terror camps. So if these military operations by Turkey were to increase, if the airstrikes were to continue, or if Turkey was to carry out a ground operation, it could lead to major destabilization in a sensitive region. Because Syria is still going through a civil war. Iraq is facing a sectarian crisis and a political crisis. So in such a sensitive region, where there is a ready base available for radicalism, terrorism, any further escalation of such conflict could bring in more extremism and radicalism and could even lead to the possible revival of notorious terror outfits like Islamic State. Turkey is not just targeting groups like PKK, it is also targeting the YPG, the Kurdish People's Protection Unit, which is seen as an extension of the PKK. So these are the major Kurdish militant groups which Turkey has labeled as terrorist organizations, and it has launched major military operations against these outfits, which are based out of neighboring Iraq and Syria. Now that is why this development is very, very important. And of course, India has major interests in West Asia. The instability in Syria, in Iraq, the possible revival of ISIS, also the role of Turkey in West Asian geopolitics, they are all of great importance for India, and hence India would definitely watch these developments very closely. So this brings our discussion to an end, and I hope it was a fruitful session. So if you benefited from it, do support us by liking the video, share your comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Good night.